Hey Rich, have you ever seen the movie Homeward Bound?
You know, I remember one of my teachers wheeling in the TV one day and showing us and us all be exciting, not knowing that we would be receiving trauma that I still carry to this day. What about you?
Yeah, I've seen it, of course. I showed my daughter Homeward Bound for the first time this past weekend, and I have a take. Shadow, the golden retriever that everyone loves, the main character, if you will, in that movie, is by far the dumbest of the three animals that is in that movie. Shadow, the only reason why these animals are in danger is because Shadow put them in danger because he has the worst intuition of any animal I have ever seen in my life. I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years, but there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have, and I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest, and I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro. Welcome into another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I'm JJ Zacharyson, who is becoming a best ball bro, joined, as always, by Rich Ryan. Rich, what's going on, buddy?
I had to bro it up. I got to go backwards, snap back. You know, we're getting into bro season hard and heavy here. So I had to join in the, really what it is that my hair is an absolute catastrophe right now.
Yeah.
So we're going hats up.
I feel that. I'm very jealous of people who can shower at night, go to bed, wake up the next day, and still be able to like do their hair, because my hair will just be stuck the way that it looked in bed throughout, you know, the hopeful 7 to 8 hours of sleep that I get that night.
Yeah, I use, I believe it is intended for women, but it's like a non-frizz because I have the thinnest hair possible. And yeah, if I do not apply that and step out into society, I look like an absolute disaster.
Interesting. Speaking of disaster, I drafted the worst Best Ball Mania team known to man literally an hour before we started to record. I set myself up like there's nothing more tilting with doing a best ball draft than when you go through the first like 4 or 5 rounds of your draft and you feel pretty good about the individual picks that you're getting, but there's just no correlation at all with those picks. And then you get into round 6 and it's kind of still going on and you can't quite, you know, you're getting sniped from these like game stack pieces, you know, like into round 7, round 8. And that kept happening for me. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to build some later round stacks. You know, I'll get like a Charger stack. I'll get Justin Herbert because I drafted Ladd McConkey. Josh Palmer obviously gets drafted 30 picks before ADP, so I'm not able to get him for the stack. And then Justin Herbert gets drafted 20 picks ahead of ADP, so I can't get Justin Herbert. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to pivot. I'm going to at least go with a, you know, late round New England stack of some sort. But of course, I was able to get Drake May, and so I had some sort of like New England Charger situation going on. But then I was like, I need a QB3 because Geno Smith was my other quarterback. Like I had Geno Smith, Drake May. I need a QB3. There's no way I can win anything with Drake May and Geno Smith. And I'm like, let's just take a chance. This team is absolute dog doo-doo right now. Let's just take a chance and say, I had Michael Pittman. I had drafted Devin Singletary for some week 17 correlation. Why not go for Danny Dimes and pair him up with someone in the last rounds, and maybe he can relive some of that rushing magic that we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, Dimes gets drafted like 2 rounds ahead of ADP, so I couldn't even get him. My quarterbacks on this team are Geno Smith, Drake May, and Bo Nix. Rich.
Bo Nix!
I mean, it's disastrous. I posted it to the late round fantasy football Discord because I need people to realize that, you know, even though I'm becoming a best ball bro, I still, you know, have some pretty awful lineups. I'll bring it up right now. Figured that it might be helpful to read you the entirety of the team. It is Bo Nix, Geno Smith, and Drake May. Running backs are Breece Hall, Jonathan Brooks, who I like Jonathan Brooks. I've been talking about that. I also did a running back dead zone study that dropped in the late round podcast feed that really favors a guy like Jonathan Brooks. Devin Singletary, Gus Edwards, Zach Charbonnet. So those are my 5. I went with a 5 running back build because Breece Hall, you know, being sort of like an anchor there. And then at wide receiver, I have Jalen Waddle, Zay Flowers, Michael Pittman, Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey, JSN, and Javon Baker. And then I have Cole Kmet, Hunter Henry, and Greg Dulcich at tight end. I don't like getting Cole Kmet. This is one of my I only get him in game stacks, and I had to kind of force it because I needed that Seattle-Chicago, week 17 correlation. But I was getting a little cute. Like I got Jalen Waddle, 6 picks ahead of ADP to kind of change things up. I'm trying to learn here, Rich. I'm trying to listen to these bros and these pros tell me, to change things up with your 1-2 picks, your first and second round picks, to differentiate your lineup a little bit.
Sometimes you swing and miss. These things happen. Now, I have to ask, was this a slow draft? Because you also put in the late round Discord that you had a need for speed this past week, got into a fast draft, and catastrophe struck once again.
Yeah. I mean, it was a fast draft. This was a fast draft, but I also, as you noted, I think I put this on Twitter, right? Where I joined a fast draft. And literally 30 seconds later, so I entered one of the marathon contests. If you guys aren't paying attention to what's going on with the contest and stuff at Underdog, you can join a marathon. It's a $15 entry. There's no playoff. It's just weeks 1 through 17 cumulative scores. So it's a different strategy, and I talk about that strategy with the guest of today's show. But I joined this marathon draft, and I am excited. Maybe it wasn't a marathon. Maybe that draft actually was a BBM, but regardless. Oh no, it was a Greyhound. It was the $6 entry. Anyway, I just promoted the marathon for you guys, just so you guys know what that's all about. It was a Greyhound draft, and I joined it, and 30 seconds after I joined, my wife's prepping something in the kitchen, and it's Sunday. We kind of just hung out all day because the weather wasn't that great. And I don't know, if you have kids, if you don't have kids, I have a 1.5-year-old and I have an almost 6-year-old. She'll be 6 in July. And having that in your house, even for 24 hours with not going outside because of weather, is just very, very difficult on your mental state. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to join a draft. I'm going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, be a dad and draft at the same time. And then all of a sudden my wife says, hey, I need you to run to the store. I need some stuff for dinner. And so I'm like, all right, I got to do it. So I joined that draft. I'm driving and drafting, which I don't recommend anyone do, but it was all local. It was
only
literally
at red lights. Only at red lights and stop signs for
only
those.
At red lights. Look, it was only throughout my neighborhood, and there's a lot of stop signs, and then there's a couple lights until I got to Publix, which is really close to my neighborhood. And so get to Publix, and I don't get a shopping cart because I didn't need that much stuff. By the way, you should always get a shopping cart. You always get more stuff than you think that you need, right? And so I'm walking around and I'm drafting while I'm trying to find the dairy-free cheese at Publix. Fortunately, I found that. And I think the draft didn't end up that bad, I don't think. I think that team build was actually okay. But it's posted on Twitter if you guys want to check it out.
You said dairy-free cheese? I didn't know you had dietary restrictions.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard or not. This podcast feed doesn't know that I'm gluten, dairy, and soy-free nearly as much as the Living the Stream podcast feed. But yeah, I mean, I've been joining a lot of marathon drafts, because I just think it's kind of interesting and fun.
What's your biggest pivot? It's not on our show sheet, so I might be asking you something cold you haven't fully prepared for, but I know you're doing these drafts, so you're thinking of this. Obviously, top of mind, the biggest pivot is we don't have to cram in week 17 or week 16 game stacks as much because it's cumulative points. So what has been your biggest pivot point when it comes to doing these marathon drafts?
Yeah, our guest Liam Murphy has some takes on this, and I'll add to, I won't say what he said necessarily. The thing that I just thought of immediately was I'm probably going to lean heavily on just individual team stacking and not necessarily, I don't care at all about week 17, obviously. I'm not game stacking anything, which is kind of nice. You also are really, really shooting for ceiling in sort of a different way with the 17 weeks where, in an individual week in the playoff weeks, right? You can find a guy who just gets hot, right? Like you could find a tight end who has spiked weeks at the right time and stuff like that and still come out on top. But for this, it's just a little bit different because you need that production all season long and you have to think about it, from a full season perspective. So I do think now that I'm thinking about it and talking about it, I do think you can make the argument that maybe rookies are a little bit more devalued in the format because week 1 to 8 is just as important as week 9 to 17. And so hypothetically, we know, and I know through research that rookie wide receivers, rookie running backs, especially the the non-stud ones, the non-blue chip ones, they generally do a lot better during the second half of the season versus the first. If you're talking like, Bijan or Jahmyr Gibbs last year, or maybe even like Marvin Harrison Jr. this year, that's not going to they're going to produce right away. Like it's not going to take them until week 9 or 10 to really produce. But one of the upsides and benefits of drafting rookies is that they're so much better during the second half of the season. Like their production, like you can do analysis to show from a season long perspective that rookies are really good values no matter what throughout your redraft league. So sure, you can get rookies strictly from that standpoint, but when there is a focus on the playoffs in the late season, like in your home league, like in Best Ball Mania and a lot of these best ball contests, they're actually even more beneficial to grab. So like I'm okay in a lot of these best ball drafts reaching a full round to get a rookie wide receiver, even a rookie running back, but wide receiver, it's even more glaring and obvious. Like a Jermaine Burton, a Jalen Polk, like those kinds of guys. I'm okay with reaching about a round early to get those players because I know that their production's going to hit and spike more than likely at the correct time. Whereas in this marathon, man, I mean, that Jalen Polk could do very little to start. Jermaine Burton's a great example. Like he might not do that much to start the year, or even like a Ricky Pearsall who could be buried behind Ayuk and Debo if neither of them either get traded or what have you. And so I do think that maybe there's a little bit of a downgrade there, but I'm still going to draft them because overall, season long, rookies are still better values than non-rookies.
Yeah, maybe there's an interesting exercise out there for somebody that looks at coaches and them putting rookies in or giving rookies more opportunities earlier than not. I know I can speak personally from my fight in New York Jets that it took 4 or 5 weeks for Garrett Wilson to get up to like a 70% snap share, which was outrageous if you look at the wide receiver room when he was drafted. So maybe what JJ is saying is definitely going to pertain to the Jets and especially Braylon Allen, who looks like he's going to be the RB2 if this OTA hype comes to fruition. But maybe somebody out there, you look at the Coach Speak Index or something like that on Twitter, and maybe you can mine and see some of these coaches that might give rookies an opportunity earlier than not. You also said here in the show sheet that your BBM5 entries are picking up a ton. You've got a target of 50 by June, the completion of June. So how's BBM doing? What are your biggest focuses right now?
Yeah, I might even up that to like 75 or so. Yeah, look, BBM I think is going fine for the most part. I think the one thing that I'm really trying to work on is picking and choosing when to not go wide receiver in the early rounds. Like I'll rarely go running back and quarterback in the first 5 rounds these days. Some of that is because of what Hayden talked about last week and just, the importance of getting all of those wide receivers. But what I'm noticing most with ADP and with running back value in particular is if there's a position that's going to fall into round 5 into round 6, like a round 4 player going into round 5 or even into round 6, from like that's just free falling throughout the draft, it's going to be a running back more than a wide receiver. It's almost never a wide receiver. You have, T. Higgins, for instance, in round 4, he's never a round 5 player. Like it just doesn't happen. Or like Christian Kirk in round 5, he's never a round 6 player. He always goes in round 5. Whereas Rachaad White, Rich, I mean, earlier in the draft season, he was like a early to mid 4th round pick, I believe. And then, he slowly went to the 5th round. And now Rachaad White will go into the late 6th, and I've even seen him go in the 7th round of drafts. And so the running backs will fall at times. And so what I'm trying to do is pick and choose when I'm going to attack those players because I am playing high volume, right? So if I have so many entries, I'm going to just try to extract as much value as I possibly can from the running back position as opposed to the wide receiver position, because the wide receiver position just is not going to fall the way the running back one is, largely because we know that everyone's going to be just snagging them up and drafting them no matter what. And so I don't want to fall behind. I want to keep getting those wide receivers, and I'll let value sort of fall to me as opposed to forcing it.
Yeah, it's funny. I just Control F'd RB to look at ADP change over the last week, and I scrolled all the way to the bottom to see who the biggest fallers are, and there's just yellow all over the place at RB. All the other positions are pretty evenly distributed, but I'm seeing Keaton Mitchell, J.K. Dobbins, Nick Chubb, Austin Eckler, Ramondre Stevenson, Tyrone Tracy, all dropping in ADP, and not many WRs are around them.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's great. Like the market there is nuts. And I've mentioned this before, but the way that I formulate my best ball rankings over on the Patreon is I take my redraft rankings and I have a formula that they sort of get spit into, and then it comes out the other side with these underdog rankings. And I have a weight in that because in redraft and regular redraft, I like running backs a lot more than I do in best ball for market related reasons and even just the game type that we're playing reasons, right? And even still, I've been a more wide receiver heavy ranker through the years, with my redraft rankings. But I think people would be shocked when I've thought about this a lot over the last week or two, where we see Isaiah Pacheco go in round 5 oftentimes. Isaiah Pacheco, and I think I mentioned this in my interview with Liam, Isaiah Pacheco could be a second round pick in your redraft league this year. A lot of these running backs that are going in 4, 5, and 6 in these best ball drafts, they're like second round picks in redraft. And so I'm trying to balance, the redraft market and the best ball market, come up with this formula. And I realize now that I need to weight wide receiver even heavier in that formula to push up these wide receivers, because I'm looking at my rankings when I'm drafting and I flip back and forth from rankings to ADP to just see sort of how to extract value best. And what I'm noticing is there's pockets in these drafts where, wide receivers aren't on my rankings list for like 20 guys when they should be near the top, or there should be a good mix of running back and wide receiver. That's just the way this market is. That's just the way that this game goes. And you can't ignore it. You have to play into it. You have to get these wide receivers.
And your process should change. If your volume of drafts goes up and your learnings go up, it would be foolish if you created a formula in April and never changed it.
Right.
So
right.
The fact that you are changing your formula through the process and intaking new data to do so is wise. It would be foolish to do otherwise.
Yeah, and there's also, this is kind of related to this, but there's also Superflex drafts that are going on now. The Superflex puppy that Underdog launched. I haven't done one yet. I don't know if I'm going to be very aggressive with them, just because I'm more interested in maxing BBM and doing some of the, I like the marathon a lot, and I'm trying to master, if you will, or get a lot better at just the classic game, as opposed to digging into the Superflex side and how things look there.
It's a totally different game. You've been exercising certain muscles, and then all of a sudden they want you to play left-handed.
Right, exactly. I will say though, I've gotten a lot of requests from people over the last week saying, are we going to get Superflex underdog rankings, which I just don't have the time and ability right now to do that for that one specific game type. But I also think people sort of overrate going from single quarterback redraft to Superflex rankings, and how much that, the way that I would look at this is I would take a single quarterback ranking sheet. I would look at positional rankings, let's say. Okay. You can look at overall rankings too, just to get the positional rankings. But oftentimes Superflex drafts, the market is not consistent from one draft to the next, right? Like your home league Superflex league, you might see the QB12 go in round 2, and in another league that QB12 might go in round 5. There could be a lot of reasons for that, whether it's scoring, whether it's the supply and demand side and how many running backs and wide receivers you're starting, what have you. There's just a wide range of how Superflex drafts will go down because we don't have as much data on that, and people are kind of wild and crazy in that format because all of a sudden quarterbacks do matter a little bit more, and when quarterbacks matter more, people are going to get crazy with it because quarterback is an interesting, important position in real football. Now, when you look at best ball rankings from a single quarterback to a Superflex league, what I would do is just use the single quarterback rankings and see how the market is sort of developing at quarterback in these Superflex leagues, and just react based on your tiers, based on where these guys are ranked in general, right? You don't need to say, oh, hey, here are my Superflex rankings. I have 8 quarterbacks getting drafted in the first 10 picks, because that might not be the way that individual league's market is really going to work. I think that's really true for attacking any format, is that you really need to understand tiers so that you can extract as much value in your individual league's market. Because I've always looked at fantasy football where you have sort of the overarching market, which is ADP, which is what we all look at and gravitate towards and want to sort of beat, right? But then there's your individual league. Like the league that I just did, the Best Ball Mania draft that I just did, where people were drafting quarterbacks a lot earlier than I anticipated, that's that individual league's market. And what happened? I didn't react fast enough. And now my freaking quarterbacks are Geno Smith, Drake May, and Bo Nix, right? You need to be able to react to your individual league's market. And that's no different in Superflex. So I'm not saying that like it wouldn't be helpful to have Superflex rankings. I understand it would be helpful to have them, but you can still use the same positional rankings for Superflex and just use ADP as a guide to know when to attack these particular positions.
Yeah, I know you've talked about U theory previously within auction drafts. First of the tier, last of the tier are going to cost the most. In the middle is where the value. And you can use that, not that you're going to be spending dollars in an auction, when it comes to these drafts, right? When the tier starts, you just be aware that the guys in the middle are going to go after that. And then there's going to be a rush as the tier starts to close for people to grab that last guy. Let's get into some individual players who you've been drafting the last week, and there is still a running back in the Emerald City that has captured your eye. ADP has him up moving slightly, only 1.2 spots, still going in the 12th round, JJ, so I'm sure you're very happy to scoop this guy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming the ADP is moving up because I'm drafting him everywhere, every opportunity I get. Jokes aside, look, Zach Charbonnet I still think is just a really, really good value. This is a standard case of a player who is being drafted at his projection who has contingent upside, where they have a brand new coaching staff. We have no idea how run heavy, how pass heavy. I mean, if they take some of the concepts that we think they might take, they could be a fairly pass heavy offense. But I saw reports this week where they want to be a little bit more run heavy, whatever. Regardless of the direction they go, it's going to help Zach Charbonnet, right? It's fine. Like he can be a runner. He can catch passes, but if you look at the data and I said this whenever they made the Charbonnet pick, and I wasn't totally right because I think that they still gave Kenneth Walker a little bit more work, at least from during the front half of last year, than I expected. But I think if you look at what happened towards the tail end, Charbonnet started getting used a little bit more in that offense, and we saw that Charbonnet is what we thought he would be from a prospecting standpoint, where he's just a solid back. He's like a James Conner type back. He can do everything right. He's he can catch passes out of the backfield as a bigger bodied guy, which isn't something that we always see. And he's someone who can grind out yards better than Kenneth Walker can. Walker is a great, great player, especially from a home run hitting ability standpoint. Kenneth Walker can make gigantic plays, and that's the one reason why I'm still okay with drafting him in best ball, because I know that Kenneth Walker has an RB1 ceiling each and every week in fantasy football. With that being said, Charbonnet could hypothetically dig into that workload more than we expect. That's one out for him. This offense could be better than we expect as well, which I think it is. I think the offense in general is just undervalued. Like DK Metcalf, whatever, but like JSN, I think could have a really good year. Tyler Lockett, maybe he's still effective at his age. But in general, I think that it's an offense, and Geno Smith, something that me and Hayden both talked about last week. Geno Smith is just a solid value, I think, at quarterback. But if this offense is better than expected, then that's going to help everyone in the offense. But then the contingent upside. If Kenneth Walker goes down, Zach Charbonnet, like I always think about the contingent upside this way. If this player were not part of his offense, where would you be drafting this player? I say this all the time on the show. I might have even said it about Zach Charbonnet. And if Kenneth Walker didn't exist, Zach Charbonnet would probably be like in the Josh Jacobs range. Like if not, like would he not? Right? It would be his backfield. Josh Jacobs is splitting with Marshawn Lloyd, or at least, Lloyd is a threat. Maybe he'd go around where Isaiah Pacheco goes. So there's a lot of upside still with Charbonnet, and he's being drafted at his projection, which is why I'm drafting a lot of Charbonnet right now.
Charbonnet, a very solid 90.3 year 2 score. This next guy, wide receiver for the Baltimore Ravens, has an excellent year 2 score of 96.8, and you are slamming the draft button on Zay Flowers.
I think Zay should be a 3rd round pick, and he goes in the 4th. So I've reached for him plenty. I don't even know if it would be considered reaching in these wide receiver heavy formats, but I think that it was actually funny. That team that I was just talking about, I went with a 4 wide receiver start, maybe even 5. But in that draft, I passed on Michael Pittman and I took Zay Flowers over Pittman. And I think that's a take that I might stick with throughout the summer. But regardless, I ended up taking Zay Flowers at towards the end of the 3rd round. I think I was in the 9 spot. And no one wanted Michael Pittman, so I just got Michael Pittman in the 4th. So I still ended up getting Pittman. Yeah. So it was like the right, because you only need one team to like a player to then draft that player. And I obviously ended up choosing right in that someone probably would have liked Zay Flowers, but clearly people weren't liking Michael Pittman that much. But the Zay Flowers thing, you have a second-year receiver. When you have a second-year receiver who had a very, very, very good year 2 score, like an elite year 2 score, those players in the wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 range hit at a very, very good rate. And so I think you look at the landscape in Baltimore. I know his splits weren't as good with Mark Andrews last year, but I also think Baltimore is going to naturally be a little bit more pass heavy this year because I don't think their game scripts are going to be as favorable as they were a season ago, just based on regression. I think there's a lot to like about Zay Flowers this year.
Second year with Todd Monken and Lamar Jackson too. I'm sure Todd Monken wants to open it up even more this season. All right, we talked about 2 exciting players, good year 2 scores, a lot of juice. Let's talk about your 2 highest rostered quarterbacks and come back to earth a little bit. Rookie Drake May, who you just drafted in the fast draft that you mentioned. And once again, Bryce Young hunting those Carolina stacks. What do we got here, JJ?
Yeah, as I said in the show notes, help me. Look, I don't have like insane exposure to quarterbacks because I don't think it's necessary. So like Kyler is up there, but I do have Drake May and Bryce Young at like 13%. So 13% is not that high from an exposure standpoint in a single player. Like a lot of people are going to be well over 20% for their highest rostered players. With that being said, it's clearly a play on if I get an elite quarterback, I am not getting another quarterback generally until the final couple rounds. And when I'm doing that, I'm just getting a cheap stack. And Drake May and Bryce Young, Geno Smith is in that group, but in order to get Geno, you almost have to have invested in one of those wide receivers to make it.
You got to spend for
worthwhile.
DK or JSN. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Whereas with these other guys, like you can make like Drake May has got plenty, 3 later round wide receivers. Jalen Polk's rising a little bit, but Javon Baker's still late. Demario Douglas, you can go Kendrick Bourne, you can go KJ Osborne if you want to, and Hunter Henry as a tight end. I don't mind. And then Bryce Young, I'm a little surprised that people aren't latching on to the Dave Canales hype a little bit more based on what he did with Geno Smith in Seattle, based on what he did with Baker Mayfield in Tampa. And that week 17 game, Carolina gets Tampa Bay. It's not really a matchup that you're going to be overly afraid of maybe. And so, I just think that Young has an opportunity he's not going to be a QB1. Like I know what happens to quarterbacks when they have as bad of rookie seasons as Bryce Young had. I'm not optimistic about him in Dynasty. It's none of that. It's just the fact that you can get him oftentimes in the 17th round. And if I have Josh Allen, if I have Jalen Hurts, if I have Lamar Jackson, or even Patrick Mahomes, I generally am not investing, in a high-end QB2 with that guy. I would rather just wait. So I think that's more of a reflection on that situation more so than this insane optimism about these quarterbacks, but I think there is at least something that we can latch onto with these guys. Bryce Young, better weapons, a better coaching staff. Drake May, sneaky rushing upside, right? Like there's still something that we can latch onto and say, these guys could be okay enough in fantasy football.
It's funny. I caught like the beginning of a UFL broadcast this weekend and I saw Harry Douglas, Falcons legend. Harry Douglas was a sideline reporter. And for some reason I thought it was Pop Douglas. And I was like, he retired? He's a sideline reporter now? Like JJ's got so much exposure to him. What's going to happen? I got to text him. But no, it was just.
I know that people have given me a hard time for my Demario Douglas exposure in pre-draft drafts, but there was a quote from Drake May today saying that Demario Douglas reminded him of Josh Downs, who played with Drake May.
Who you also loved. You also loved Josh Downs.
I love Josh Downs too, yeah. But he played with Drake May in college and dominated. That's why his production profile was so good as a prospect. So, look, all you haters out there who say that Demario Douglas has no upside, just listen to Drake May.
I love it. All right, last 2 guys, running back position. You've got fades here. You dumped on him last week in the intro. Was last week Ramondre Stevenson, and we've got Zamir Jones here as well. Dead Zone episode dropped today, which you talked about it, but expand upon these 2 players.
Yeah, Zamir White.
Excuse me.
Yeah, no, you were seeing in
I was
the
seeing
notes.
Aaron Jones right under it.
Yeah, I called out Aaron Jones because I want to talk about really quickly before we get to the interview today with Liam Murphy, which is another great one. I've been very lucky to be talking to these like incredibly good players and smart people.
Another champ.
It's yeah, exactly. Another champ. But I did this study in the feed, which you guys probably listened to yesterday if you're listening to all the episodes that I drop. But if you didn't, I would go back and listen to it. It's one of those episodes where, not every episode that I drop am I like, oh my gosh, this is something that I need people to listen to. But I do think the Dead Zone one is really important because I get questions about it all the time. And I really try to formulate it in a way that you can walk away and really take something from it. And so, the TLDR of that is basically low end RB2s have been very, very bad bets in fantasy football in the past. But if you have a rookie or a second year player in that RB2 range, even high end RB2s aren't as good of bets as like low end RB1s. Like there's a pretty clear teardrop. But if you have a rookie or a second year player in that range, those guys are actually great bets. If you have an RB2 who's a rookie or a second year player, he performs just as well, basically from a ceiling perspective, as low end RB1s. So what that hypothetically would mean, let's just pretend in a world that Jonathan Brooks ends up being the RB23 this season from an ADP standpoint. He hypothetically, based on history, would have a similar ceiling outcome as Kyren Williams, right? I don't think that, I'm not saying...
Yeah, you're just grabbing two names. Nobody out there lose your mind.
Right. Yeah. Don't lose your mind sitting there saying, don't sit there and say, I saw Kyren Williams be the
Someone
RB3
just drove off the road. Someone just drove off the road somewhere.
Yeah, that's not what I mean. I'm just taking any low end RB1 type. That's what Jonathan Brooks could be, right? But then the opposite in that RB2 tier is true too, where if you have veteran running backs, this is what the running back dead zone really comes down to. It's not a dead zone for all running backs. It's really a dead zone for veteran running backs because these guys are veterans in the league who still can't become and get drafted as RB1s or even high-end RB2s. These guys are basically getting juiced up because of projected volume, and that projected volume often disappears even if you can't see a path to it disappearing, which is a very important thing to remember. Everyone saw that with Mike Davis in Atlanta just a few years ago, and then Cordero Patterson comes out of nowhere and steals a lot of work. Myles Gaskin was part of that too in Miami, and he wasn't able to keep up this monster workload, right? I see that happening 1,000,000%. I mean, from a forecasting standpoint, with Ramondre Stevenson. I think Ramondre Stevenson is just insanely overvalued right now. And then I think that Zamir White is insanely overvalued right now too. Because I think the guys that you're going to get, in 2 rounds later or a round later. Now, on Underdog, I will say that drafters have done a pretty good job of sort of closing that gap and keeping those guys closer to like the Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren, Arizona running backs into the Cincinnati running backs tier. I don't think that's going to happen in your home leagues. But there is one player, Aaron Jones, and even like David Montgomery, I hate to say it. I think Montgomery is still intriguing because of his contingent upside. But Aaron Jones, the more that I've looked at this data and thought about the research, I think Aaron Jones is a dead zone back this year. And so I'm trying my best to not get him as a standalone running back in these drafts. Instead, I'm just going to get him in game stacks with Green Bay whenever, my draft kind of goes that way.
Yeah, and Alex Collins, by the way, need to add him to the list. Generational dead zone running back. And the other thing that you brought up in the episode that I really liked was don't be fooled when the dead zone running backs start to slip a little bit, right? Like, especially in these best ball drafts. If you see the receivers there that have value, don't be fooled by the fact that these guys are going maybe like a half round or a round later than they should be, these dead zone running backs. Like, you need to really let them slip before you decide to pull the trigger, or if you love your roster construction. There's obviously situations where you can take these guys, but don't let it force a pick that you shouldn't make otherwise.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that I would not be overexposed to Zamir White, Ramondre Stevenson, Aaron Jones, and maybe David Montgomery, but I think Montgomery is in a good enough situation and has that contingent upside to where I'd be okay with getting him especially in a best ball format, right? I think a guy like Aaron Jones, there's no contingent upside. Like if Ty Chandler gets hurt, okay, what's that? I mean, maybe he'll see a little bit more work, sure, but it's not like the same as David Montgomery seeing Jahmyr Gibbs getting hurt, And so I think that's one of the keys is that I'm still going to get some exposure here and there in game stacks. I'm probably only going to be at like I'm assuming at the end of the summer when I'm looking at exposure, I would guess that Ramondre and Zamir are in that like 2 to 3% range. Like at most maybe. Like I just I'm not feeling it that much when I can get some of these other running backs who project pretty similarly, just a little bit later.
All right. Well, let me bow out and let somebody who knows what they're talking about talk to you.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, we got to get Liam to chat a little bit so people can stop listening to me talk about the running back dead zone more, because you can just listen to the freaking episode instead of me having to just say it all over again on this show. But yeah, Liam Murphy, he won a Best Ball Mania in the past. He's had 2 other big Best Ball wins. We talked about what makes him a successful player in Best Ball. The single elite quarterback strategy, which is something that some folks have been touting, where you only draft one quarterback on your Best Ball roster. So we talked about that a little bit. We talked about the strategy for the marathon and much more. So without further ado, Liam Murphy. This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. If you haven't played on Underdog yet, now's the time, because Pick 8 is live for the NBA Finals. Create entries with up to 8 picks, and Underdog will automatically double flex entries, so you can miss up to 2 picks and still win your entry. The best part is, you can win up to 325 times your original amount. Don't miss your chance to try Pick 8 before it's gone. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the app to sign up. And when you do, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND. That's one word. When you use that promo code and you make a deposit, you'll not only get a deposit offer, but you'll also be emailed a free copy of the Late Round Draft Guide when it drops on July 1st. That's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. All right, Liam. So you obviously have had a lot of success playing Best Ball. Can you let the listeners know what contests you've won, how well you've done historically thus far, whether it's on Underdog or not?
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate enough to win Best Ball Mania 2, which feels like, eons ago at this point.
Yeah.
At the time, it was the biggest Best Ball tournament winning in the world because Underdog made it $1,001. So I was really fortunate to win that one on my cousin's bachelor party. We were sweating that down in Key West. It was an unreal experience. And then parlayed that the next year and won the 2 high stakes tournaments on DraftKings, which was their $555 tournament for $250,000 and their 2K tournament, which was, that one's only like 144 people, but I count it, and took that one down for $50,000.
Heck yeah, man. Do you like remember where you were when you drafted that Best Ball Mania winning team?
I'm like pretty sure I was on my couch because it was a June draft, and I'm pretty sure I was like on my couch watching a movie because I like roughly remember the start of Jonathan Taylor and Aaron Jones, because that year, Best Ball's changed so much as far as like what's offered, but like that year, there was all the Aaron Rodgers rumors of like, I can't quite remember what it was, but it was causing Devontae Adams and Aaron Jones to fall, and like allowed me kind of like unique combo due to like fear. Not that like Aaron Jones was essential to winning or anything, but I kind of remember that time cycle. So I'm pretty sure I was on my couch and watching a movie and drafting.
Just casually winning $1 million from your couch.
Yeah, just casually sun running, from the couch.
No big deal. What do you think then has separated you as a consistently good, successful Best Ball player? What do you think like separates you from maybe players who aren't as consistent or aren't necessarily putting in the is it work that you're putting in? Is it a mentality that you have? What do you think really has been the separation piece for you?
Yeah, I wouldn't say just me, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm the best Ball player in the world, right? Like, results does not always mean you played well, right? Like I think I'm a good Best Ball player. I do put in work. And I would say a couple of things separates like a good Best Ball player from probably someone who needs a little bit of work, right? Ultimately, yeah, like a little bit of work will get you pretty far because most people are just not willing to even like do anything. They're just there. They're ripping their drafts. They're not doing anything. From the get-go, I've not been afraid to have like my own thoughts, where back in Best Ball Mania 2 and before, there was almost no content on Best Ball. What little content you had was like people being like, oh, you know, you can't stray too far from ADPs. Like the market is a really, you know, correct force. And I was like, no, I think the market is like terrible in certain situations. So like I was getting like heavy ADP stands. As far as like anyone out there trying to improve their best ball game, it's kind of hard what to say because different people struggle at different things, right? Like some people probably just don't have good structural builds, right? Where they're just allocating too many running backs or too many wide receivers. Like back when the year I won BBM2, a big takeaway of mine was I was starting wide receiver heavy and ending up with too many of them. Right. Whereas like I was starting like 5 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds, but ending up with 9 of them. And, and like kind of my takeaway was I need to be, there's no reason to do that. Right. Like I need to believe that these 5 wide receivers I start with are gonna return value. They're gonna fill my starting lineup spots, and I need more darts at running back. Some people are not thinking about how do you win, right? How do you advance through these playoff groups? How do you beat people in the finals? They're more thinking of how do I advance? How do I beat my pod? Which, building a team that can beat your pod. Okay, it's got a chance to win, but it's made the playoffs. But it's not necessarily the same thing as like, how do I beat 500 people in the finals to win $1.5 million versus how do I, advance out? And then it's like best ball is like ultimately like a weekly upside game, right? Where like I think a player like Devon Achane represents this, right? Like some people are like, what is this guy doing being a second round, a third round pick, right? Like because they're thinking of like, what is his season long projection? They're thinking of the fact that like Mostert's going to see the field. Maybe Jalen Wright sees the field. Whereas anyone who plays best ball knows that Achane can literally give you 50 points and win you weeks, which is what you need.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because I remember last year, this year I'm playing high volume. Last year, I played I played more than the average person, clearly. Like this is, I'm a fantasy football analyst for a living. Clearly I'm going to be playing a decent amount of best ball, but like this year I'm just taking it to the next level. But I remember last year I wasn't heavy enough on the 49ers, and part of the logic and the thinking that I had going in was really just like the season-long mentality. Obviously, the 49ers like outperformed expectation, in terms of just like how many touchdowns we thought they were going to score, all that kind of stuff. But regardless of that, it's still looking at this from the perspective of in a season-long managed league, you're probably not going to love George Kittle. You're going to have this insane roller coaster, as we've seen for years with Kittle. You have this insane roller coaster ride. But and from that perspective, like I wasn't really going after him heavily, like in best ball and stuff last year. But I do think that he's another example of that, where you're getting a piece. And this year, I think it could be like Houston, right? Where Houston individually, the wide receivers on those teams, yeah, we might only see each of maybe only 2 of them end up as wide receiver 2s, and then maybe one of them is a wide receiver 3 into wide receiver 4. Maybe 2 of them are wide receiver. However, it ends up happening. But there's obviously contingent upside with those players. And then on top of that, there's the spiked week aspect where we know that offense is going to have firepower. And so if that 1 week is a Nico Collins week and he catches 10 balls for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, we know that's in his range of outcomes in a given week, despite having Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell there. But then there's also that contingent upside. I think that's a point that really gets lost for people when they go from season long to best ball, because in season long, it's a 50-50 game. I mean, like you're going up against your opponent. Of course you want these insanely impressive, legendary lineups that you just crush your competition no matter what, week in and week out. But at the end of the day, if you're playing in a 12-team season long league, like you're not a format, you're really not going to need the same. You don't look at upside the exact same way as you would in best ball. And that's been a huge change for me. Like the Achane example is great because I remember the start of this offseason and approaching things. I'm like, man, Achane, why is he going at the 2-3? Like, why is he going in the late second? Now he's obviously going like early third, oftentimes even into the mid third. And at first I'm like, no, I can't do this with Devon Achane. But I've been gobbling up him up a ton after talking to Crane a little bit. Obviously, this discussion, it just makes a lot of sense. You got to flip that switch and sort of think of best ball in that manner. Now, to that point, you said that what you think could separate you, and obviously you're going to be humble about it. But what could separate you is that you weren't afraid to sort of go against the grain to some degree with player takes, with ADP, and thinking about ADP as not the gospel. Do you think that drafters are sometimes a little bit too rigid with their overall draft strategy, who they're taking, and they focus too much on previous season data, especially when it comes to best ball, where we've only had 4 of these tournaments? Like, and you mentioned it, like the first 2, especially, ADP was not even remotely what it looks like today in terms of where positions were getting drafted, wide receivers going where they go today versus where they were going even 2 years ago. Do you think that people are possibly being a little bit too rigid with the way that they are approaching their roster construction right now?
100% yes. And real quick, I just wanted to say, because I think you bringing up the 49ers is such a great example of like a best ball mentality. I feel the same way about the 49ers as I feel about the Bears players and the Texans players, right? They're all probably too expensive to work out in your brain if you're just thinking of a season-long league, right? But you're not playing a season-long league when you're playing best ball. You need to advance out of your pod twice. So you need to advance out of your pod in 2 mini tournaments. So you really want players who can get you there. And then you need to beat everyone in the finals. So, like people who were like, oh, how are the Bears guys going to pay off? It's like, I think Caleb Williams could throw for 4,500 yards and 30 plus touchdowns. Like, I think he can do that. I want pieces of this. And yeah, like if someone goes down, they're going to win you. On the topic of if people are too rigid, 100%, right? Because like, I feel a lot of data that I hear, there's data that's descriptive, meaning it's describing what worked the past year, right? And then there's data that's predictive, which is like what we care about, right? And it's hard to isolate what is predictive versus descriptive. In best ball, what's especially complicated is you have injuries year to year, right? So if 5 running backs get hurt in the first round and you're just someone out there being like, late round running back smashed, right? But you're ignoring that, like, well, 5 dudes tore the ACL. Like, really, you're just saying, okay, these guys got hurt last year. The other thing you have to think about is what is available later in drafts, right? So like if you're going to say, oh, late round running back is a smash this year, or for this year, late round tight end, right? Oh, late round tight ends always worked. But me personally, I don't feel like the same tight end archetypes that have smashed in the late round are necessarily there this year, right? So you can't just copy and paste what worked the past year. I think another thing, and I've written about this one, which is another thing that I'm hearing a lot this year is, why would I draft early when last year, if you drafted in August, you smashed because you got Puka Nacua, you got Kyron Williams, you got Tank Dell. And it's like, hold up, people, like, let's add some context here. Do you think you're going to find a Kyron Williams every year? Do you think you're going to find a Puka Nacua every year? Do you think you're going to have Tank Dell scoring a preseason touchdown and bringing him from like nearly 0% drafted to 100% drafted? Like, of course not. You're not going to get that amount of value every single year, late round in drafts. And, as far as like drafting early, what if Breece Hall tears his ACL in August, right? Like, not wishing injury on anyone, but then Braylon Allen or whoever the Jets backup running back will go from an 18th round pick to literally a 3rd round pick or higher, right? So that's a lot of value for drafting early.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I also think that like people, when they focus so heavily on what happened, the positives, the Pukas, the Tank Dells, etc. I mean, like, what happens if Jonathan Brooks goes to OTAs or goes to training camp and he is totally healthy? He's just totally fine. And we get reports that he is going to play and that he's ready week 1 and he's going to be their bell cow. He's not going to be RB24 anymore, right? He's probably going to be he's probably going to go in like close to Pacheco or like Rashad White or something, right? And so like, it's very easy to get fixated. I've found, at least, to get fixated on the outcomes of what just makes your argument favorable without looking at the entirety of the argument. I seem to agree. I mean, have you seemed, I don't know if you've looked this up or not, but have you found that your lineups that you've drafted in, say, May or June? Because I was actually surprised. I saw that you were doing your live streams and you're up to like 50 BBMs so far, something around there, right?
Yeah.
And now I know that BBM's filling faster this year than it was last year. And I actually started entering a little bit more just to kind of like, I'm like, all right, this is getting a little scary how quickly this thing's filling. But regardless, like, is that a typical number for you? Like, it seems like that's probably, I could be completely wrong with this, but it seems like it's on the higher end for someone who's max entering to have 50 done by the end of May or that first month and leaving yourself with 100 for the final 3 months of this summer. Or is it really just you being like, dang, this thing's going to fill. I want to get my 150 entries in, before maybe it fills in like the end of July or something like that.
No, I'm not worried about it like filling too soon. I think it will fill a little bit earlier this year just because they kept it the same size and they're offering different contests. So maybe it fills like 2 weeks earlier. But it largely has to do with like most years, I want to do around a third of my drafts early, around a third of my drafts late, and then just 50 throughout the summer just to see what kind of news cycles we get. And also has to do with me, like I don't slow draft just for my mental health. It's not great for me to feel always on the clock, I like to do my drafts and be done. I would rather do I would rather do 20 fast drafts at the same time than just be on the clock for, a month. And so, I just feel like the ADPs, like day one is a day I always want to attack, right? Like that's when Keon Coleman was going in the hundreds. Ladd McConkey was going in the hundreds, right? Certain running backs like Marshawn Lloyd, you could get in like the 17th round, right? Like guys that steam up. So, and it just has to do with me having to do fast drafts on all the other sites. So, I have to keep the volume up so August doesn't come and like all my dopamine leaves my body and I'm like,
Yeah. I got you. I need to get better at doing more fast drafts because I've been in slow draft hell for the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I mean, it's like, like literally over 100 slow drafts right now. And it's mostly because I got kids and I don't know how I can sit down necessarily and just crank these out. But I need to find time because it is, it's not the easiest always, on your mentals where you're waking up in the morning and the first thing you do instead of going to the bathroom, you open up your phone to see how much time you have left.
Did someone draft at midnight to try to rush the clock?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you could just get tilted because someone sniped your stack. Speaking of sniping stacks, there's been a lot of discussion recently that I've seen about going single elite quarterback. And I'm just curious about what your quarterback strategy generally is, because it does seem like you can go in a lot of different directions. It does seem like the quarterback market is relatively efficient, I would say, overall. Like, I don't think that there's like this like massively obvious, like 5 years ago, the quarterback market in fantasy football was absurdly ridiculous. Like you could find late round guys. I mean, that's why 10 years ago, 12 years ago, that's why I started doing fantasy football stuff, is because of the late round quarterback strategy. But it does seem like people, have generally caught on. Obviously, underdog is pretty sharp, overall. Now, but there's this discussion about getting a single elite quarterback and leaving it at that. And I just have to talk to you about the strategy because I haven't really dug in. I haven't talked to any of the sharps about this and what it all means. But this is literally get a Josh Allen. That's your quarterback. Take the 0 for his bye week, correct? And then kind of hope that he's just giving you those spiked weeks, week in and week out. And then obviously you can get an extra wide receiver, tight end, running back, etc. What's your take on that? And then I also want to sort of flip that and say, what's your take on double elite quarterbacks? So we'll say getting maybe 2 of the top 8 guys. So you're getting, putting like Kyler in that discussion.
Yeah, on this topic, I'd also like to bring up the single elite tight end because I often hear them discussed together, and I feel like they're very different things. When you're talking about a half-point PPR website, quarterback points are just mathematically worth more than a PPR website, right? So like if a quarterback puts up 40 on a half-point PPR website, they're making up a greater percentage of your score than on a PPR website because the wide receivers, the running backs, they strictly score less, right? So that generally draws me towards wanting elite QBs on underdog, right? Single elite quarterback is not something I purposely do a lot of the times. It doesn't mean I never do it. And if I were to do it, it's almost always going to be with Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts. Two guys who I think both have extremely high floors and high ceilings. A guy like Lamar Jackson, I think is more like a better and best ball quarterback, where he actually has like kind of a low floor when the running backs steal all his touchdowns in close, right? Whereas Josh Allen and Hurts kind of like are their goal line backs. On this, I mean, I have to mention that my Best Ball Mania 2 team essentially was a single QB team because it was Josh Allen and Justin Fields. And that year, Fields like barely played. And when you look at like on Josh Allen's bye, Fields contributed like 2.7 points.
Yeah.
And then never hit the lineup any other week.
That's crazy.
Right. So it was just a Josh Allen team. So it's not something I do a lot. Why would you do it? Obviously, you would do it to get yourself extra bullets at running back, wide receiver, tight end, where you can separate, right? And like the whole thesis is QBs rarely separate, where, you know, if a quarterback puts up 40 points, okay, separating. But in the weeks where quarterbacks put up 25 to 15, even 30 to 20, you can make up the gap, right? Like when I won with Josh Allen, he scored 2 rushing touchdowns against the Falcons, so I had like 24 QB points. Joe Burrow put up 35. It didn't matter. I still made up the gap because I had the Rashad Pennies, the Amon-Ra, the Jamar Chase. Like I nutted out at the skill positions more. So single elite QB rarely, but you know, I think it's okay to do occasionally. You just eat the 0. Still, you know, why would you want a second quarterback? Just because you want low owned players, right? Because, you know, like when Kerrane won, he had Daniel Jones and Tom Brady. And funny enough, they both like were QB 1 and 2. One of them was really low owned though, right? So like in the year where like, you know, I can't remember which one was the higher owned one, but in the year where the higher owned one does not, you know, score well, and he has this low owned guy who puts up 35 points. Okay, now he's separating a little bit from the field.
Yeah.
Single elite tight end is something I will never ever do because tight ends are, you know, they're dependent on touchdowns. And so just thinking about how the playoff pods work and how ownership really condenses on players who score well. Like in BBM2, Mark Andrews had a great season, had a great week 16. And so all of a sudden, Mark Andrews was like 50% owned in the finals, right? So you would argue that you would want anyone else. And my Noah Fant, 5% owned, scored 2 touchdowns with Drew Lockett and Lock, you know? So like you want a low owned tight end who falls in the end zone twice is extremely valuable, and you're separating from the field to potentially win life-changing money.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So essentially, quarterbacks you're going to see a wider distribution of the number of quarterbacks and the different quarterbacks that are in the final, right? Versus at tight end, you can get 50% Mark Andrews because their spiked weeks can be so enormous in the playoff weeks that it really carries that team. Makes a lot of sense. So if you're going with an elite quarterback, let's say you get Josh Allen, say you get Jalen Hurts, and you do get a second quarterback, are you almost always just like throwing a dart with that, like Bryce Young or someone random like that, or Baker Mayfield or Geno or someone, and not investing? You know, obviously you could invest in another elite quarterback, but even like a middle, let's say a higher end QB2, like a Caleb Williams or like a Tua or Trevor Lawrence or something like that. Are you more inclined to just wait, throw that 17th round dart on a Bryce Young, or would you go with a Tua or a Trevor Lawrence?
In general, I think it's, you know, really logical that if you're going to spend the capital on an elite quarterback, you should be waiting on your QB2. You know, the year I won with Josh Allen, my QB2 was Fields. That actually was like a mid-round pick. That was like a 10th and 11th round pick. My 5-5-5 team that won with Mahomes, my QB2 was Geno Smith, unstacked in the 20th round of DK, you know? So like that was like, I got my guy, I'm waiting. And Geno Smith actually had a great year that year. It doesn't mean I never do, you know, double elite QB teams. If I am going to do something crazy, like a Josh Allen and Hurts team, right? I'd rather do it early in the draft cycle when ADPs can be really wrong, just because, all else equal, sure, I'd love to have 2 elite QBs if I'm hitting the right values at running back, wide receiver, and tight end. But we just know, yes, you should be waiting. But, you got to have some Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels teams. I've done like a Josh Allen, Brock Purdy team, just because like they can ping pong, and if you can hit the right guys at running back and wide receiver in the later rounds, you can make up for it.
Yeah, makes total sense. In the early rounds, are you more frequently going with or without a running back? Let's say through the first 3 rounds, does your typical team build have a running back or not have a running back this year?
Without 100% on underdog, right? Like wide receiver prices are more expensive than ever before. Sometimes by like 25% per round. And, like I recently wrote up all of the running backs from like rounds 8 to 20. And I just feel you can more consistently find league winning running backs, just because, A, some ambiguous situations are being kept cheap. And B, we know that if a starter tears his ACL, how good does the RB2 need to be to give you points? Whereas if Tyreek Hill gets hurt, you can have all the opportunity in the world. You're not going to be Tyreek Hill. Like Jalen Waddle, sure. But, is Odell going to turn back the clock and all of a sudden be, Tyreek? Probably not, right? So it's a position that just depends on more talent wide receiver. So definitely I'm starting my drafts way more often without a running back.
It also feels like some of the running backs this year, man. I mean, we talked about Achane. I feel like the line is like around Achane. Like I'll get Achane when he drops, into that 3rd round area because I know that he will in drafts that I do. So I don't need to necessarily force it. But you can poke holes in so many of these running backs, like arguments, right? Like you look at Derrick Henry. Okay, he's old and we know that he's shown some wear down. And then you look at Josh Jacobs, okay, split backfields with Matt LaFleur and Marshawn Lloyd. Okay, Isaiah Pacheco. What if they don't give Pacheco the receiving work that he got down the stretch last year? Okay, Rachaad White. All right, well, he hasn't been very efficient on the ground. What if Bucky Irving steps in and sees? You can make arguments against a lot of those guys, whereas at wide receiver, yeah, you can make the arguments, but at the same time, we know that we need these wide receivers. And so even if they don't necessarily live up to the hype and live up to expectation, they can still be really beneficial to your lineup. Whereas it feels like the running backs need to hit, like the running backs you're drafting in the first 5 rounds almost need to hit because the opportunity cost and not getting those wide receivers has become so immense. I've been getting the question about like people who are drafting on underdog and, they're listening to this podcast and they're getting more and more into it, which is awesome. And they're like, why can I get Isaiah Pacheco in round 5? And it's like, okay, I don't mind that as a value every single time, but like you got to get over the idea that this is your normal home league because it's not. Pacheco's going to go in round 2 in your home league this year. It's just that's Josh Jacobs will be a 2nd round pick in your neighborhood league, but that's just not what's going on here. And you can sit back and say, well, this isn't good value. This isn't good value. Okay, what are you going to do about it? Because people are still going to be drafting wide receivers and you're going to be screwed if you don't lean into that. So it's good to hear that you've also been, going down that wide receiver heavy path.
Yeah. And coupled with that, is like who can fall around? Pacheco can fall around, right? Like Pacheco goes in the 4th a lot, but occasionally he'll be there in the 5th where you can get a unique, even Amari Cooper, he's not falling around, right?
Yeah.
Even Christian Kirk, he's not falling a full round, right? Even George Pickens, right? Like he's not going to be there in the 6th ever on underdog, right? So as far as like getting a unique team, like I'll take some of these guys sometimes. I like taking Kyron Williams sometimes, especially in the 3rd round where what if they just play Blake Corum? What if Blake Corum is a little Tank Biggs BS, right? I've seen the league winning ability from him. I think he's good, but I just know that in general, I like a lot of the running backs in that 8th, 9th, 10th round, 11th round, right? Like we have like whole backfields who don't get drafted there to really good teams.
I know. It's crazy. I've been talking about ambiguous backfields for years and years, right? And there are so many of them this year that we haven't really gotten in the past, / a lot of those situations are in really favorable offenses, like really intriguing ones where you can get a little bit of both. Like you can get both. You can get some Zach Moss and some Chase Brown. Like you can get pieces of these backfields really, really easily. I mean, whether it's Arizona, who I think we should be more bullish on just in general from an offensive standpoint, or look at what's going on in Pittsburgh and Arthur Smith being there and them going to be more run heavy. So I agree. It just, the draft's set up. When you look at your team at the end of every draft, and I know that this is just a feel-based thing and it's not necessarily like this is how things are going to go down or anything like that. But when you look at your team that was more 0 RB after the fact, you feel a lot better about that team. Like just from a structural standpoint, from just what it looks like and the players that you got, you just feel better about that squad because with 0 RB, if everyone in your league is going 0 RB, you can't just kind of do the opposite of that. It's not really that possible because people they're not stopping with their wide receiver drafting. Like they're not done after round 4 and then you can gobble up all this value in round 5, 6, and 7. They're still drafting wide receivers because they're going to have 8 or 9 of them on their roster.
Yeah, with any extreme strategy like 0 RB or heavy RB, you can get burned by a room, but far more often when you start with, 5 wide receivers, 6 wide receivers, you're not going to feel that terrible about your running back room. Right. Every once in a while, you'll find a running back heavy room where one dude's like taking 8 for some reason. And you're like, oh, great. Now I got to now Ray Davis is my RB2,
Yeah. Right.
But, when on stream the other day, I started with Kyron, Bijan, and, in the 3rd round, I was planning to go wide receiver. And then all of a sudden, Pickens, Cooper, Kirk all go on the inside of the 3-4 turn. And I'm like, whatever. Okay, I'm taking ETN, who I like a lot, and my wide receiver room is maybe it works out, but probably not.
Yeah, right. And you're well, that's the other thing that I've noticed too, is that especially if you are newer to best ball and underdog in particular, is that when running back value does fall and you've already invested in running back, your inclination is to say, well, I'm just going to keep getting these running backs because the value's there. You got to stop. You got to really hold yourself back and just pinch your nose and say, all right, I'm going to get Tank Dell in the mid to late 3rd instead of the mid 4th because this is the way this room is going and I can't fall behind because when I fall behind, I'm absolutely screwed. And so you're going to lose a little bit of value at wide receiver, but I do think that's been an important lesson for me, at least, doing more and more of these drafts is you can't fall behind, man. You just can't fall behind a wide receiver. You're going to hate your team after the fact. So Underdog came out with the marathon last week, which is a different kind of format. We've been talking about these contests with playoffs where, you're trying to have that weekly upside in week 15, 16, 17 to advance and then obviously win the thing. But the marathon is a week 1 to 17 cumulative event. So you're just trying to draft the best team, get the most points during the regular season and win. So my question to you is, with these drafts, number 1, have you been doing them? But also number 2, how would your strategy change from the playoff formats to then thinking about weeks 1 to 17?
Yeah, I really like that Underdog segmented their tournaments this year, where last year it was combined.
Yeah.
And it was just too much of the prize pool to the regular season versus the playoff weeks. So, the marathon, as you said, is just total points, weeks 1 through 17. I think it can be argued it's a little bit of a less strategic format because it's kind of like if you don't get the best players, you lose. Say you're choosing between Pacheco and Josh Jacobs, and one of them finishes as RB1, and the other one is RB10. It's like, okay, how much strategy was that you just got the right player there, right? But digging in, I would say that unique combos at the top of the draft are even more valuable, right? Because we know that the market drafts by ADP at the top of, they just do, right? Where CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra were combined 20% of the time last year. Now it worked in week 17 as well, right? They both had great weeks, but when you looked at CeeDee Lamb with a guy who went at the 2-3 turn, right? Because CeeDee Lamb was the back of the first, like a guy like Chris Olave, that was all of a sudden down to less than 1%, right? So I think unique combo where both players score super well. Say you start your drafts at the 1-2 turn with Ayuk and Nico Collins, right? All of a sudden, no one has that. They're not doing that. They're not combining that with 3-4 players. You've really given your chance to just not compete with that many people where you're trying to score the most points. I would also say that you need to have the mentality of I need to beat every single person that drafts a team, not I need to beat my room. Where you're like in my high stakes draft sometimes where I'm like pushing my quarterback, sometimes I notice that these guys who don't need these quarterbacks take my quarterbacks unstacked last year just because they're like, well, I don't want this guy to get the team. I know he won last year. They're kind of hurting themselves a little bit, but they're really hurting me, right? Where that should not enter your brain at all. You should not spite draft at all, because if you're doing anything to make your team suboptimal, you're not going to win. Player takes are obviously super important. So if you have a feeling that a player is like really mispriced or could be RB1 in the late rounds and top 5 running back, you got to get them. And then I think construction would generally pull you towards 0 RB, where it used to be thought that like, oh, probably you want to start with 2 RBs or at least 1 RB. But I think the teams that have really smashed from a total points perspective the past couple of years are teams that have started 0 RB and just hit the right late round running backs. And the last thing I'd say is you cannot get buried at any position. So even tight end, that can work in playoff formats where you just get the right guys to fall in the end zone. But if you're giving up like 200 points at the tight end position, you're probably not going to finish as the top scoring team.
Yeah, so you basically need the late round tight end that ends up hitting, or just go with the elite tight end where you have a better feeling about them actually producing. Do you think that, so obviously you want to stack teams, right, to get that weekly upside and such. Do you think there's any validity? Because obviously with like the playoff contest, we're trying to stack week 7, we're trying to game stack in week 17. We're trying to get that correlation to get that upside in that singular playoff week. I've seen some takes out there about stacking like within divisions, for instance, because you know that those teams will be playing each other multiple times. And if those games blow up, then you're getting those really, really big spiked weeks in those individual weeks. Do you think there's some validity to that?
I do, right? Because I mean, stacking doesn't necessarily raise our chances to get a 99 percentile outcome, which like we might need, but it raises your chances of getting like a top 90% outcome. So yeah, like if you stack a division that you think is undervalued, I think that can pay off. Some people ask if stacking is as important in a total points contest. And I would say that in general, yes, because you need to think about it as like a weekly game where if Nico Collins goes for 30, probably CJ Stroud is having a good week. So it raises your chances of like getting, needing to get less things right. But there are certain quarterbacks, I would say Purdy, Stroud, Caleb Williams, where if they really were huge ADP values, I would take them unstacked just because with those offenses, I feel like they could support 4 guys and maybe no one separates where you really need to have that wide receiver. But in general, you want to be stacking just, to raise your chances of getting something right each week.
Speaking of stacks, every draft, people have felt it where they don't get the stacks they want. Someone snipes them and they're looking for some cheap stacks late. Are there any cheap stacks that you've seemed to be gravitated towards and go to in your drafts thus far?
Are you asking more of getting a whole stack late, or are you asking more of getting a quarterback late? Because let's just say a quarterback and maybe one of his pass catchers. Like nothing super, super heavy, but just something that you get a little correlation. You can get a late wide receiver and then pair him with a late quarterback just to get a little bit more of that correlation in your lineup. Definitely. Yeah. I mean, last year, one of the reasons I had a lot of CJ Stroud is because, I don't watch college ball. And when a guy goes in the first round of the NFL draft, I'm going to close my eyes and take that guy when he's literally the last quarterback drafted in best ball. So like I was like, great, this guy went 2 overall. He is here in the 18th round. Welcome CJ Stroud. So this year it's Drake May and the Patriots wide receivers. Last year, I was the one saying, what are we doing? Like, why? Who are these people talking about who are saying the Patriots could be feisty? I did not feel that way at all with Mac Jones and Devontae Parker and co. I thought this was like an abysmal team. I don't feel the same way at all this year, right? The Patriots, they drafted Drake May. They drafted 2 wide receivers. They added some O-linemen. They're trying to support him to be successful. So Drake May and any of the Patriots wide receivers, like even Kendrick Bourne, even KJ Osborne, We're not really sure. No Juju Smith-Schuster, who, I mean, I guess he's a little healthier this year, but primarily Jalen Polk and Javon Baker, right? The rookies are the ones that I feel have the highest upside. Daniel Jones and the Giants wide receivers, I think, is interesting, where you can literally get Daniel Jones, Jalen Hyatt, Darius Slayton, who's always good and always free, something like that. Even a Bo Nix and a Josh Reynolds, I've done sometimes, right? Where, okay, Bo Nix is probably not the best guy. He had a really low college ADOT, right? He's probably a check down guy. It's rumored not a lot of teams had him as like a first round quarterback. Whatever. He won the first round. He's with Sean Payton. Let's end our drafts with some of these. And then, like sometimes like Rodgers falls to like the 16th round.
Right.
Like him and like Tyler Conklin is like, sounds great to me. Like I think like Rodgers could for sure smash this year on what Vegas thinks is a good team. And if he's healthy, why couldn't he like sun run a bunch of touchdowns?
Yeah, I like those calls. I really like the New England call. The other thing with Drake May that I feel like people just are ignoring is he runs the ball. Like he has rushing upside too. So he's not only can you get these pieces late. Like Jalen Polk's been rising a little bit. I'm still drafting him for the most part. Like I still think he's fine to get. But you can get Demario Douglas, Javon Baker, KJ Osborne, like you said, late in Kendrick Bourne, and then just get Drake May. And it's you might have gotten some Chargers earlier on in the draft. It's a really ugly game on paper, but who knows what happens, in week 17 when everything goes down. Last question for you. What player ADPs either make no sense to you in a favorable way, like you think that they're way, way undervalued, or they're just way, way overvalued?
Which one do you want to do first? You want to do the too expensive or the too cheap list?
Let's do the too cheap guys, the values right now.
Okay. So I'm giving you players at each position here is what a QB, RB, wideout, tight end. For quarterback, I really think there's like three guys that stick out as too cheap. I'd say Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, and Jaden Daniels, right? Let's do Jaden Daniels first, because as the guy who had like 30% plus Anthony Richardson last year, I don't get it. Like the market saw him play, saw him be great. He got hurt. And they're like, great, 5th round pick, right? Like we saw it. And then they have a better prospect probably who's going to run the ball. Yeah, he's not as big. He's probably not going to be as much of a goal line back. And they're like, yeah, but rookie 10th round, right?
Yeah.
I don't get it. Herbert, okay, maybe they are going to be run heavy. But I mean, I legitimately think Herbert is a top 5 real life NFL quarterback. I am not taking guys like Jared Goff over Herbert. If I have a Amon-Ra, yes, I'm going to stack it instead. But like, I just believe in Herbert's ability to support, a very serviceable offense. And then Trevor Lawrence, I like what the Jags did. And I think people are really underrating how bad the Jags O-line was last year and how unlucky Trevor was with like Calvin Ridley, where, I mean, they legitimately could have had like 8 more touchdowns if the NFL field was like 5 inches wider.
Yeah, I love Jag stacks right now because it's really easy to do too. Like it's not like if you just get one of those guys, you could easily just where they're lined up in the draft from an ADP perspective and where they fall and stuff. It's easy to get a Jag stack at the end of the day.
Absolutely. On the too cheap list, I'll give both the Bengals running backs, Zach Moss and Chase Brown. You mentioned them earlier, but I mean, talk about finding league winners. Like I think Moss has the edge at being the goal line back. If Chase Brown were to become the 1A though, he's an athletic freak where unlimited upside there. So taking stabs at I'm in on the offense being good for the Bengals.
Sure.
I think Joe Burrow being in the 90s is kind of insane too, where he falls. So Chase Brown, Zach Moss, try to leave your draft with at least one, if not both. Taking both is definitely fine to me. At wide receiver, I'll give a rookie trio of Jalen Polk, you mentioned, Ricky Pearsall, and Jermaine Burton. With Pearsall, I just believe he's good. 1st round pick, right? We know that ambiguous situations gives the market fear. They're fearful that he won't see the field. And I just think that he's good enough. He's going to find a way. Jalen Polk, high 2nd round pick. Yeah, it's rumored the Patriots wanted one of Keon Coleman or Xavier Legette, and so maybe they had to settle. But still, right? I believe in Drake May's ability as a top 3 quarterback, who some had as QB2 or higher. And so like him, and then Jermaine Burton attached to the Bengals again, where he's got to give you a lot more than Tyler Boyd did, even with third round capital. And at tight end, I like Jake Ferguson as a potential. Like, you look at the Cowboys; they didn't really add anyone. He could easily be their second target. I think he has a really high individual week upside, and there's really not that much different between him and some of the tight ends going higher than him. Like, I love Dalton Kincaid, but it's conceivable that Ferguson scores similar to him.
Yeah. Oh, he's a definite Dalton Kincaid arbitrage play, where like you're drafting Dalton Kincaid right now mostly from a volume perspective and the fact that there's a lot of ambiguity going on around him, but that's pretty similar to Jake Ferguson, where it's just CeeDee Lamb and then Ferguson's just kind of sitting there. So I totally agree with that.
On the too expensive list, these like the prices change a lot, but at quarterback, I went with Baker Mayfield just because he was like in the 150s. And it's because while he had a good year, he gave you a bunch of like 20-point weeks. He has almost no ability to win you a week, right? Where like, he's almost never giving you those 30 points. I think he literally did it once. He scored a bunch of 20-point weeks, right? But like, you can find 20-point weeks. You can find 15-point weeks for free. So I don't get paying for Mayfield. Like, okay, if you have Mike Evans, you have Chris Godwin, sure. But like I'd almost rather just have Drake May even with those pieces and just hope that, Drake May, you mentioned as rushing ability, just seems to have more upside. At running back, I went with Nick Chubb.
Yeah, I agree there.
Where, I mean, look, I don't really know what to do here, but the dude had a gruesome injury. He's old. He offers almost zero from a pass catching ability. He got his ACL reconstructed in November. So it's not like he got hurt early, but then they retouched him up in November. And there's a lot of guys around his price who I think also offer league winning upside who are not have all these questions. So I'm just comfortable fading him. I like betting on the other guys. I think you can read into the D'Onta Foreman signing in a couple ways. You could say, D'Onta Foreman's replaceable, right? Like he's just going to be there to start the year. And then, Nick Chubb will come and everything will be gravy. You could also say that D'Onta Foreman weighs 233 pounds. Kareem Hunt was the goal line back last year. It's going to be the Ford and Foreman show. And Nick Chubb is not going to be a part of the equation this year. So I'm passing on him right now. At wideout, I went with George Pickens and Jordan Addison, which, I'm sure some people are, it's a little bit of a hot take here. With Jordan Addison, it's that, maybe JJ McCarthy is super good, but we're paying for that right now, right? Where I just don't know if he's going to be able to support, I think people are underrating how good Kirk Cousins was for Jordan Addison. And, second year wide receiver, I want to bet on these guys, but I don't want to bet on them when they're super expensive. And like Jordan Addison's son ran from a touchdown perspective, like the 49ers guy falling down and Kirk Cousins hitting that deep shot. Like, I just don't know if that's going to be the same thing. Jefferson's going to be target dominant. If TJ Hockenson returns, he's like way more of a threat for targets than, like DeAndre Hopkins is available full round after Jordan Addison. And it's not that dissimilar as a bet. So I'm not saying don't draft Jordan Addison, but I don't love it in the 6th round like he's going. With Pickens, I'm just generally of the mind of like a top-down offense type of guy. And okay, if Fields is out there, I think maybe it's actually exciting for Pickens because you look at DJ Moore, you look what he did where Fields wasn't that great. He has really high individual week upside, but he just like he's not a separator. I just don't generally like to bet on these non-separator expensive wide receivers. Like I'd rather take a guy like Christian Kirk, who I think Trevor could throw for way more touchdowns than the Steelers offense. And at tight end, on the too expensive list, I went with TJ Hockenson. What are we doing here? The dude got really hurt late in the year. Like what are we doing?
When's he going to play? Like week 12 at best? right?
Yeah.
Like it's I agree. It's bizarre that he has had, and it's kind of, I mean, I know that it was higher before, but it's still pretty high, his ADP. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you there with Hawk.
Well, in and I drafted a lot of TJ Hawkinson last year. I was the guy who's being like, this guy could be tight end 1. And that was right, kind of due to injuries, but it had to do with a little bit with Kirk. But, even as he falls into the range where it's like, now you want to take running backs. And it's like,
right,
I don't want to carry a 0 for 12 weeks for questionable upside with the JJ McCarthy offense,
yeah, yep.
This is a 6.5 win Vegas team. Like that's not it's not the best.
Yeah, it makes sense. Makes total sense. The Jordan Addison thing too. I've only gotten him in game stacks. Like if I'm leaning Green Bay or something like that, and like I just want that game because I think that game could be fun, late in the season. But yeah, I mean, like you look at Addison's secondary numbers last year, really not that strong. I mean, he wasn't like horrible, but it was a pretty like just an above average kind of rookie season where I think a lot of the perception of Addison in both the dynasty and redraft space it's skewed by touchdowns and how he was just able to score them last year and be, helpful from that perspective. Liam, this was awesome, man. I think a lot of people will get a lot from this discussion. Can you let everyone know where they can find you and what you're up to?
Yeah, I'm on YouTube. You can just type in Liam Murphy. You might have to add fantasy football or something like that. And I write best ball work at beatbestball.com. Recently launched that.
Awesome stuff. You can obviously check out all my stuff over on lateround.com. As always, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in.